Stephen Patrick is a spiritualist, believing that we are called by God and the good spirits to a life of service to others in the spirit of faith, hope, and charity. Stephen shares his gift of mediumship with others in order that they may develop and progress on their own spiritual journey. Stephen has been a Santa Muertero for over 15 years. With his knowledge of herbalism, Stephen works closely with the spirits of the dead to bring healing and balance to those in need. Stephen is also a local historian and is currently working on researching and documenting the history of the spiritualist movement in Rochester, New York. We're chatting with Stephen today on Third Eyesight. My name is Juan Francisco, and I'm a psychic medium and tarot card reader. I've always been curious about the supernatural, the paranormal, and psychic abilities, and I'm here to share my stories and interview folks who want to share their own stories with us. Let's get to it. Patrick, Stephen, thank you so much for joining Third Eyesight today.
I'm happy to be here.
It's so excited to chat with you.
It's a long time coming.
Yeah, we've been Instagram buddies for quite a while, so I'm glad that we finally got to do this. Thank you for coming onto the podcast. So I want to ask first, where are you based? And tell us a little bit about what you do.
So I currently live in Rochester, New York, and for those who are unaware of like the geography, because usually people hear New York, they automatically assume New York City. It is upstate Western New York on Lake Ontario, so across from Toronto. So it's very heavily forested, very cold, and also like the third biggest city in New York. And so a lot of people kind of forget about us up here.
Well, before we hit record, we were sharing that we have that common Italian heritage from Naples.
Yes.
Well, I have something else for you. In a past life, I did PR for the Finger Lakes region, including Rochester, New York. So I know a little bit, like a lot of fun facts.
Funny.
I know a lot of fun facts about Rochester, like the Fox sisters, which a lot of people know, even if they don't know about Rochester. The National Museum of Play.
That's so fun. I love
It's so fun. It's so fun.
And literally, you can visit Sesame Street for people that don't know what that is.
It's so
check
fun.
It out.
Susan B. Anthony's home. Yep. I did all the things with Rochester. So, and I know that you call yourself a spiritualist. So can you explain what being a spiritualist means to you, and how does that come through your work with people?
So, to kind of the word spiritualist is a very loaded term, and there's a lot to unpack with it. At its kind of basic meaning, it pretty much just implies that someone who believes that the soul exists after death, and that it is possible to communicate with said spirits that exist after death. That is like probably the most basic definition you could get. But as you mentioned, kind of with the Fox sisters, there's a whole historical, religious, scientific, and philosophical tradition that goes along with spiritualism. So there's sort of like little s spiritualism, which is just basically you believe in the afterlife. And then there's sort of like capital S spiritualism, which is part of like this whole kind of rich tradition of like a very kind of unique spirituality. So I'm a spiritualist, big S, where it's I'm kind of part of this like religious tradition, and then this this umbrella of like the historical spiritualist movement encompasses a ton of different kinds of traditions. So there's kind of more American style spiritualism. There's spiritualism in England, and those are sort of like the ones that I think the English speaking world is most familiar with. But then you have Spiritism as it developed in France, which is like kind of an offshoot of spiritualism, or kind of like a denomination, if you could call it that, of spiritualism. Then from there, you have all the different traditions of like a spiritismo, and kind of those derived traditions as well. So it's this really big family of different spiritual traditions that all kind of originated here in upstate New York, which is pretty fascinating that like it became this worldwide religious movement in kind of such a short amount of time, because it only started in the late 1800s.
Yeah, and I read on your website that you have done some research on the history of the spiritualist movement in Rochester, and something that I've delved into on this podcast. And now I'm not a historian, I have not done my research, but based on my understanding, just it seems like the spiritualist movement really kicked up in the United States right after the Civil War, a time of so much loss. But what is your before now I'm going to ask you this question up front. We're going to get into your journey to where you are today in just a moment.
It's
I'm
fine.
really curious to hear
I
from
will
you.
always
Yeah.
talk about this forever.
Yeah,
So
I'd
it's
love to hear from you. Like,
fine.
what is your perspective on? Well, am I right? Did it seem to kick up after the Civil War? And with the Fox sisters, there's so much out there about were they authentic? Were they maybe sometimes authentic? I'd love to hear
So
your
I have
thoughts
all
on all
sorts of
those
opinions
things.
on that.
Sure, give it to us.
um, so the spiritualism movement actually technically started before the Civil War, um, right on the edge of it. But before I get into kind of more like detailed stuff, often spiritualism sees a rise in people that are interested in it pretty much anytime there's some kind of catastrophe or war or pandemic even. So the Civil War increased a rise in spiritualism, World War One, World War Two, and then even most recently, the pandemic itself kind of got people more interested in it. And it's sort of like because in these dark times and chaotic times of when things like this happen, there's a lot of death and there's a lot of pain and things. And spiritualism offers not only like there's obviously this comfort in knowing that you can speak to people who have passed into spirit, but as a tradition, it also offers a lot of kind of healing on multiple levels and has always kind of promoted like self-care, mental wellness, things like that, way before this was kind of like those were common like buzzwords and stuff like that. One of my favorite little historical bits that I kind of discovered in my research was there was a spiritualist church here in Rochester that started in like the 1930s. And there was an article I found in the newspaper from like it. So it actually started like the very beginning of the 1930s, so it's the Great Depression. And there was an article in the newspaper about the woman that founded it, and it was pretty remarkable because they were interviewing her, and she was talking about how she was effectively giving people free therapy sessions. Like, and this is before, way before, like that was an established thing. And she was talking about how people were depressed from the depression and the loss of jobs and stuff. And she talked about how she was like counseling people and helping them and promoting like kind of mental wellness and things like that. So spiritualism has always had this very like long history of healing, and I think that is kind of what brings a lot of people to it. I feel like a lot of people kind of just like, oh, it's because people die, they talk to the dead. There's so much more to it. So just it's just kind of remarkable because the more I think people actually read about like the history of spiritualism, which is difficult because it's very undocumented, which is what I'm trying to work on. The more they see it's more than just like people in black having seances in the dark, which is kind of what I feel a lot of people think it is. Um, to kind of go back to what you said about the history of it, I gotta ask, like, what do you want me to say about that? Just because I could go on for hours about it. So, like, what's a little quick question about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll ask a very pointed question specifically about the Fox sisters, because the Fox sisters seem to have been attributed with being culturally at that time, or maybe up to today, like the face of the spiritualist movement in America, or part of like what part of
Yeah,
the folks
no,
who
I
catalyzed it. So yeah, what's your
yeah, I
take on
get
the
what you
Fox
mean.
sisters?
So,
Yeah.
so the Fox sisters are three sisters that lived here. Uh, they lived in a small little village outside of Rochester called Hydesville, which doesn't actually exist anymore. Um, it's part of like another township, but they also lived in Rochester. The Fox sisters are kind of not seen as like the founders of spiritualism, but their actions kind of led to spiritualism becoming like this legitimized spiritual movement. So the story that most people hear and talk about is these two sisters. At the time, they were like, I think like 14 and 11. I could be wrong. People will probably like kill me for saying that if I'm wrong. But they were young teenage, young preteen girls. Um, and they were living in a small little farmhouse. And on March 31st, 19, or not 19, 1848, I think I could be wrong. They developed a method to communicate with a spirit that was living in their house. It turned out to be a peddler, like a traveling salesman that was murdered, and they managed to kind of communicate with him through knocking noises. These are called spirit raps, which is a form of physical mediumship. So they would ask a question, and then they would hear a knock, like a yes or no, and then they kind of also turned it into, like, they would use the alphabet, like one for A, two for B. So this story kind of spread through the area, and it was very, like, at the time it was sort of like a haunted farmhouse. Like it was not like this spiritual movement or associated with anything. And they ended up being sent to Rochester to kind of get out of the area because it was attracting a bit too much attention. And they went to live with their oldest sister, whose name is Leah Fox, who lived here in Rochester. And when they were with their sister in her house, they asked the spirits, the raps followed them. So it wasn't limited to the house. That was they realized, oh, this is unusual. Like, this followed us. And so they asked, like, the raps, like, what's going on? Like, what do you want? And at that point was kind of the shift from haunted farmhouse to, like, spiritual movement, because the raps told them, and I'm paraphrasing this, but they basically were something along the lines of, you need to share this with the world. Um, that the spirits live, and we can speak to you. And so they rented this lecture hall that used to be in Rochester, Corinthian Hall, on November 14th. And they publicly demonstrated mediumship to people, evidential mediumship to people. And that is sort of considered like the shifting point of what really spearheaded the spiritualist movement. So it wasn't that they founded it or even came up with any of, like, the philosophical teachings. It was that they were the first ones to be like, on a public platform, we can do this. We can communicate with people who have passed on into the spirit world, and you can too. And so other people who had, of course, been experiencing psychic things and spiritual things for their whole lives kind of went into this movement. And then you see other people that it developed into different ways of its own spirituality. One of the things that kind of happened was, at the time, spiritualism kind of aligned itself with very, very progressive social principles and also, like, religious principles. So, like, there were other, like, kind of movements going around at the time, mystical teachings and things like energy healing and stuff like that. And they all kind of pulled together to come into this movement, which was very unorganized at first, and then later on kind of developed differently in different countries. That's where I was mentioning, like, how in America you have, like, spiritualist churches. In other countries you have, like, spiritism and spiritismo. So that's my, like, kind of very abridged history of spiritualism.
Thank you for sharing that history. I so enjoyed hearing that. And do you plan to publish your research or your
Oh,
documentation one day?
so I actually have a bunch of my research available for free on online. That's mostly the stuff dealing with the history of spiritualism in Rochester. I'm working on a few other projects dealing with stuff like that, and a lot of it is focusing on kind of this history of spiritualism in Rochester. Um, but that kind of like overflows into a whole bunch of other things. Part of my reasoning for doing this is that there aren't a lot of books on the history of spiritualism, or if there are, they're, like, very specific people or places dealing with it, and it's not like an overall kind of book dealing with it. Or if there are, there's like two of them, and the most recent one was written in, like, 1920. So, like, a lot of people will read that and they'll be like, okay, I know, like, the history of spiritualism. And so that's why you hear a lot about, like, the Fox sisters and about some of those mediums from the early days, because no one's actually really written about other people. Um, and then you kind of, though you will get, like, random little scattered popular spiritualist mediums and stuff that write their own stuff and promote their own things, obviously, but it's still very disconnected. So what I'm kind of working on is trying to flesh out the rest of the pictures So yeah.
Got it. Well, I'm definitely going to check out your research for sure. And I will mention your website at the end of this episode.
Okay.
Before we get into your journey, I want to ask a small question about the region in which you live. Have you ever been to Palmyra?
Yeah.
Have you been?
That's basically where the Fox sisters live.
Oh, okay. Because I remember when I worked in PR for the region, they took me on a tour when I worked for PR in the region, and I went to historic Palmyra, and there's like general store. I don't know if you've been to the historic Palmyra Museum, but was some of the wildest vibes I've ever felt in my life. It
Oh
was
yeah,
pretty
no, I know. Oh, you know
incredible.
what? I know exactly what you're talking about. I actually think they were featured on like one of those like haunted ghost story shows at one point.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of those shows, but being there
I
in
know, but
person, ooh, I mean, I love those shows. I watch those shows.
yeah,
I've seen
they're
some
my
episodes of those shows. Yeah,
they're
go ahead.
also my guilty pleasure. Yeah.
And I mean, I love paranormal investigations. I love ghost tours in a way that's like safe and
Yes.
intentional. And that I did not do a ghost tour there, but I was given a tour there by the director. And I always tell people it was like I could feel it was a crowded room, but it was just me and three people. It was
Yeah.
pretty incredible.
Um,
Yeah.
in Palmyra though, I don't think they have like an actual website, but they have like a Facebook page. Um, it's called like Hydesville Memorial Park, and it's where the Fox sisters used to live. The house is no longer there, but the foundation is, and they have like a little building over it, and they've kind of like planted like a little garden. Um, and you can actually go visit the property anytime you want. But if you want like an actual guided tour, you have to like contact the kind of groundskeeper of it. But it's just a quiet little park kind of, and you can just visit there and learn all about like the Fox sisters and stuff like that. Um, that being said, Rochester is also like filled with like all sorts of stuff like that that a lot of people kind of don't often talk about. So I'm gonna plug my town in there too.
Rochester's cool, and I just find the synchronicity, other than us incidentally wearing two purple shirts, the fact that there's like the heritage synchronicity, there's the I used to work with the Finger Lakes in Rochester, so it's yeah, I love the synchronicity. It's so fun. I can go
Did you visit any of the wineries?
a few. I did. I'm forgetting their names, but I also went to like it's called Belhurst Castle, like on Seneca or Cayuga Lake.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
saw Seneca, Cayuga Lake, Cuca Lake. Um,
they're beautiful.
it's so beautiful. Yeah, I feel like it's very underrated up there. But
Kind of
anyways, yeah.
to I was gonna one thing I want to add, which is probably segue kind of into what you're gonna talk about is the area itself just has this very and I also think because you're more are you in actual New York City or are you more like Hudson?
I'm in actual New York City. Yeah.
Okay. But you've been to the Hudson area.
Yeah, I've been to the
Like I mean
Hudson.
of
Yes,
that up
yeah.
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 That whole area of like that kind of central part of New York has this just very deep, powerful, ancient, magnetic energy to it. And it's just so interesting. And I've heard so many reasons about why it is, but it's produced so many interesting like religious people and spiritual movements and religious movements and stuff. And psychics and mediums, and it just seems like the people that kind of like live around this region seem very like almost tuned in to that wavelength, and it's just very fascinating.
Yeah, the Hudson River Valley is beautiful, and also I agree with you. There is a vibe that's different. I used to live in North Manhattan in a neighborhood called Inwood. It's like the 200s of Manhattan, 200
Yeah,
streets. And up there is where I felt so much energy up there. I think it's probably a mix of residual energy from tribes that used to live in these areas and face so many challenges,
yeah.
colonialism, and I think it's also the movement of people and the transient movement of people going in and out. But I think there is something called the New York Haunted History Trail, and I
Yeah,
think when
I
I've
know.
looked,
Yeah,
you probably, I mean, most of the Finger Lakes and Rochester, yeah, you're listed, but it seems to me like so many things are registered on that trail map along the river, Hudson River. So I think it's also water. I don't know. Maybe it's something about being
oh yeah, no,
the
it's
water.
absolutely the water. We have rivers and lakes, and if you think about it, this entire area for like million years was underneath a glacier. So we have like these ancient rock formations that were carved out of things, and it's fascinating. There's so many reasons of why it might be, but it's a really beautiful place, and a lot of people just kind of don't talk about it.
Yeah. Well, you and I are gonna have to kiki one of these days and just chat and
Oh
converse
yeah,
about all these
that's
things.
gonna happen.
So
That's already been ordained. That's
we're
gonna
gonna schedule it. Yeah.
happen.
So tell us, how did your spirit? Well, life is a spiritual journey, right? So when I say how did your spiritual journey start, I mean specifically how did you discover your ability or learn to develop the ability that you have?
So I feel like so many people have more interesting stories than I do than this, but I kind of always could. I was always very sensitive to psychic impressions and seeing spirits and things like that, even as a very little kid. And I grew up in a family that just kind of treated it as normal. Not even like, because I feel some families are like, oh, this is such a thing, you need to like develop this. Just they're just like, oh yeah, yeah, me too. Like just yeah. So when I would tell my parents, I may have like like I saw this or I dreamt about this, they're just sort of like, oh, okay. Like
That's
cool.
awesome.
Like if I like when I was really little, when my great grandma passed away, I remember like I don't know if I said that I saw her, I was dreaming of her. It's kind of murky because she passed away when I was like 4. But but I said something, and my parents were just like, "Oh, what did she have to say?" Like, just not, just very like nonchalant about it. Um, as you kind of mentioned before, my family is very Italian American, and so we kind of grew up. I grew up with that like kind of like immigrant Catholic Catholicism with their Italian Catholicism, but it also had sort of like kind of this uh adjacent like belief in like spiritualism. And so my family would do like very like, they'd pray to saints, go to church, but then also would like regularly visit psychics or like believe in astrology and things like that. So I kind of just grew up with a lot of this just being around me and just kind of being okay. Um, the thing is though, I think that makes it a little different, I guess, is that I always had like a really heavy interest in spirituality, and I felt really called to it because other people in my family who also grew up around this, just it was sort of just like a passing thing. So when I was from a very young age, though, I felt pretty called to just kind of explore different things. And I feel like that kind of really like the kind of turning point was when I was like about probably 16. And by then I actually wasn't living in Rochester. So I'm from here. I was born here. My family is all from here. But I actually grew up in Southern California. So when I moved back to Rochester probably like 10 years ago, it was a like culture shock for me. Like I'm not really like a New Yorker. I'm very much like kind of California sensibilities. I grew up like in the Palm Springs area, so very South California. um and so when I was 16 though, I kind of started taking developing my spiritual stuff a bit more seriously. So I started reading. I actually started uh, with Spiritism. So I actually started learning about development and stuff by reading Alan Kardec, and his like mediums book and spirit book. And then I kind of went like full circle eventually, kind of coming back to like the spiritualism that like I was sort of born into. But
Could you actually clarify real quick what is the difference between spiritism and spiritualism
so
for
this is
you?
where I was kind of explaining where the terms become confusing, and it really is confusing. So um, Allan Kardec actually wrote in one of his books that all spiritists are spiritualists, but not all spiritualists are spiritists. So if you are a spiritualist, like I said, that kind of means you just believe in like the afterlife and things like that. And then on another level, that means you're affiliated with the spiritualist movement. So you have the spiritualist movement, and then you have kind of these branches that developed under it. So you have kind of like American, I could call it like American spiritualism. Sometimes they use the phrase modern spiritualism, but that I feel is sort of a difficult it's there's a lot of terms. Basically, when spiritualism developed in the United States, they stuck with the term spiritualist. When it developed in France, he actually moved away from the term spiritualist because at the time, spiritualism was very unorganized. And so Allan Kardec kind of wanted to call it something different. So he called his Spiritism. So they're basically different denominations of spiritualism. So Spiritism is a kind of spiritualism, and then you kind of have like American spiritualism as another kind of spiritualism. And then from there, American spiritualism is even more divided, probably possibly even more than Spiritism is. Um, Spiritism is a philosophical movement that's centered around the writings of Allan Kardec. So it's like the Spirit's book, the Medium's book, the Gospel according to Spiritism, and then there's a few others, but those are like the main three. And it's sort of people will develop their mediumship, their healing abilities based on his books, and the teachings of kind of faith, hope, and charity, which again is also something in spiritualism. So it's they share a lot they share a lot in common. They're not that different. Like I said, it's just a different kind of spiritualism. American spiritualism is a bit different just because spiritists, regardless of how much they read the works of Kardec, have a shared history of like kind of these teachings of spiritism. American spiritualism becomes complicated because it's a lot less written down. So one spiritualist church might vary drastically from another, but they all kind of correlate in these very like little loosely connected principles of just like infinite intelligence, mediumship, following natural law, and things like that. Things I'm sure you've probably heard of. And spiritism is very similar too. So they're just different. They're different methods of practicing spiritualism, I guess. One of
Got
the
it.
big dividing things in the past used to be that spiritism has always promoted reincarnation. American spiritualism has been more divided on the issue, but there's all sorts of things. So that's just kind of my rambled explanation. It's
Got it.
complicated.
No, thanks for sharing that because I think there's often confusion between the two for many of us folks. So,
I'm
um,
confused about it most of the time.
and then so you just mentioned that you were practicing in spiritism, and then you started identifying as a spiritualist. So yeah, I want to let you continue on your story of your
Yeah.
journey.
Yeah, and I still love a lot of the stuff that comes out of spiritism and the teachings. And the thing is, kind of like as a spiritualist, you can use those. Like spiritism is a form of spiritualism, so I still will quote from Kardec and things like that. Um, so yeah, so I kind of started with spiritism as a form of development, and then that, which we'll get into later, also opened the door to like a whole bunch of other stuff. And then when I moved to Rochester, I got involved with the spiritualist communities here. I started attending a spiritualist church, like an American style spiritualism, and my like language, the whole language and kind of definitions that I had picked up from like spiritism, which was filtered through like Mexican folk spiritism. Like it was very heavily like Spanish terms and things like that. So my language kind of shifted a little bit, and also sort of like how I practiced shifted just because it was a different kind of tradition. Like I said, like it's not like switching from one religion to another. It's just sort of like moving from like one practice to a different practice. So it's very like organic and fluid how all this went. But kind of fast forward a little bit, I actually, me and several other of the people involved in my past church, spiritualist church, left, and we actually started our own spiritualist society, which is now I think 4 years old. Yeah, we've been going for strong for 4 years, and we're actually like a religious nonprofit with the state of New York. So we like teach like we hold like Sunday services once a month, development circles, classes, all sorts of stuff. It's
What's
fun.
the name of it?
It's the Rochester Spiritualist Society.
Perfect, easy to look up. That's a great. That sounds great. Congratulations on 4 years.
Yeah, thanks. It's been pretty fun. I love this group that I'm a part of, and it's fantastic because how we kind of organized ourselves was we wanted to kind of be better than what we felt we were dealing with in the past. So we have a very like kind of little list of definitions that we kind of just have accepted that like are things we do, and then we don't really have any don'ts. So if you, it's sort of like if you accept, like if you would identify with these little couple principles, then you can join us and you can bring in whatever you brought from your own path with you. So we don't tell people like, oh, you have to give this up, or you have to stop doing this. So we have people who identify as spiritualists who come from like Christian, pagan, Jewish, all sorts of different backgrounds, and we just kind of meet for dealing with like these common things and just have fun.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, shifting gears a bit, I
Yeah.
see that you offer mediumship readings and you work as a medium. So what does it feel like when spirit communicates to you, and what happens in mediumship reading when they do communicate with you?
Um. I how I work is it tends to come through as very like clairvoyant and clairaudient. Um. And it's more I don't so how some of the terms I so when I do it, it's more like subjective clairvoyance, which is like in your mind's eye. So it's often kind of like an inner sight, inner voice. However, it if I'm in a group of people, it's often like kind of objective clairvoyance, which is like you see like spirits outside you. So if it's usually
Wow.
one on one, it's more kind of that way. And that's I've experienced a few other kind of modalities. That's usually how it comes through. Um, it's hard to describe. It's hard to describe kind of mediumship like that because it sort of like requires a lot of like reflection on stuff. Um, my when spirits will speak to me, it tends to be very literal, like very literal. I know a lot of people will use symbols and stuff like that. Uh, for me, it's either like there's something there or there's not. Like it's very like if they, or if they're telling me something or if they show me something, that's what it means. Like there's not a lot of um so I think some people may lean more on like kind of psychic readings where there may be like symbolism and color and kind of feeling other people's energies. Mine is very heavy into like this is the dead speaking. Like this is so it's sort of like if they have something to say, they'll say it, and if they don't, they don't.
I
One
feel so
thing,
seen because that's my experience too. And I used to get frustrated. Why can't I have a symbol dictionary? And Spirit's like,
yeah,
you don't need one.
yeah,
And it's just, and it's not that it's Spirit dictionaries are not a, I mean, that symbol dictionaries are like a unhelpful. Like I think for those who work with those dictionaries in their energy that they can use with Spirit, it's great. But there's not one way to do this. So I feel very seen. Thank you for sharing
what
that.
changed my perspective of this was I was sitting in a mediumship development group at one point, and this was a couple years back before I helped start my the Rochester Spiritual Society. Um, and we were talking about how we got messages and stuff, and I said I was like, well, you know, they just tell me stuff, like that's it. And then someone else was like, the woman sitting next to me was like, you mean you don't have to interpret it? they were like, they were like, that's amazing. And I was like, huh, I guess everyone is different. And so that kind of shifted my perspective to where I am now, where it's just when I teach and facilitate these things, I kind of emphasize to everyone that everyone is different and there isn't anything better one way or the other. This is just how you are. Like, and that's just part of you. And so everyone develops differently. So people shouldn't really like if they're trying to develop mediumship or psychic skills or something like that, you shouldn't be like put certain things on a pedestal and be like, I'm going to reach this. Instead, you should be working on developing what you already have. So that's my
Absolutely.
2 cents about that. One thing I do want to say, because I want to know if maybe you have this as well, is often so I offer like private readings with people, like private consultations, but I also do like public mediumship with like my spiritual society, like you know, platform mediumship and stuff when I do like a group message service and things like that. And for both of these situations, I often find that sometimes I'll actually get a message before I'm even there. Like like before I sit with the person or before I'm there, like I'll start getting these things in my head and I'm like, okay, I should probably like save this for later. If it's like a consultation, I'll usually like write them down, and then it like then I end up giving it as a message to the person. I just always thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, that happens some once in a while to me too. I actually just posted something on Instagram where a couple of days ago I saw two very small white butterflies. I don't see small white butterflies often where I live. They come out once in a while, but there was a day maybe 6 months ago. It was an hour before I had a reading with somebody online, and I see two white butterflies, and I just felt, oh, it's spirit. And it had something to do with the reading I was going to have. And in the reading, it's funny, at the beginning of the reading, I mentioned them, the two butterflies, and it didn't quite resonate. At the end, I said, listen, like, there's something here. I'm just, keep it, bookmark it. And then she says, you know what? I have a tattoo of two butterflies. Like, oh, that's it. And her grandmother, she associated her grandmother with butterflies. So it took a little bit of time for her to maybe remember what it meant for her to understand or let it sink
Yeah.
in. But yes, to your point, that does happen sometimes. It's cool, very wild.
The worst thing is when that happens and I don't say something, because every single time I don't say something, it comes up and I'm just like, well, can't bring that up now because
Yeah,
because
exactly.
yeah, because it'll sound like I was like fishing for something. So my advice, if you ever get an intuition, share it.
Absolutely. Now, I know that you work with Santa Muerte, so could you share who Santa Muerte is and how do you work with her?
Yes. So that is sort of separate from from the spiritualist stuff. So shifting to this is Santa Muerte is a Mexican folk saint who is personified as a female skeleton. So that is sort of like the bare bones academic definition. She is the kind of uh, the tradition of working with her is from like colonial Spanish Catholicism, indigenous practices that kind of fused together to have this sort of devotional practice towards this saint. In Mexico and as a tradition, she is very much kind of like referred to within in like Catholic terminology. So that's why it's like Santa Muerte is Saint Death, and it's specifically in using like female Spanish terminology. So she's always portrayed as wearing like dresses and gowns and things like that through kind of filtered through the lens of a Mexican cultural identity of femininity. Um, so working with her is something that anyone can do. Um, I actually, my kind of like story about this is that um, I've been working with her for a very long time, especially for someone who is not Mexican, from Mexican heritage, and primarily like an English speaker, because I kind of learned about her when I was living in Southern California, uh, and this was like 18 years ago. So it's been a long time. This was actually a little bit before she became like this kind of world known religious movement. When I started learning about her, there was nothing like in English really about her. It was, and the stuff that there was just very fragmented. There were no books really. Um, so I kind of, my story, I've mentioned this in several places. I kind of stumbled into a botanica. I was probably drawn there. And that changed my entire life from then. Like that was when I was 16, and that's when I started developing my mediumship and everything. And they were selling statues of her. And I immediately just drawn to those statues and just asked the owners everything I could about her, and then bought one, and then from there just really started praying to her, and then everything just kind of unfolded from there. Um, I literally would go to like where I used to live. We have like a big public market swap meet type thing, and we'd had vendors that have everything, like everything you could possibly imagine. And there were tables that would sell like spiritual stuff. Like one was run by like a santero, one was like a curandera and stuff like that, and they would have like all sorts of stuff, herbal things, soaps, and the little statues and prayer cards of Muerte. And so I'd actually go and ask people. I was like, well, what, how do I what do you do with this? Because they'd have like products and things that were like hers. And so I learned a lot about her at the time from asking people that actually worked with her. And then I also, as books came out, I would read a little bit more and things like that. And I also, they had like the little tiny like prayers and chapbooks and stuff you could buy at like botanicas. And so I bought them and I would like kind of go through them and like, basically translate them for myself. And then, so just over time, working with her became like it just became more and more prominent and sort of this devotion to her kind of became like the center, and then everything else kind of like moved around it. Like I feel almost like she kind of was the one guiding me to like develop my mediumship and then go do stuff like this and work in this. um and so she's just been a huge part of my life for like a huge part of my life. And yeah, so just kind of what I was going to is that anyone can work with her. There's a whole bunch of different ways of working with her. Um and um yeah, so let's like what else, because I see you like nodding and I'm like, yeah, like he has something to say.
Yeah, I've never had heard of her before, and I grew up around. I didn't grow up with. So is she would she be considered in the? Is she someone who is um seen as a guide or a guidance in the world of Santeria, or is it the world is do I have that right?
Well, so you have the word right. Yeah, Santeria. So like, okay. um Santeria, Lukumi, and Ocha are like those are all the same thing. But that is like an Afro-Cuban religion. It's very popular now in Mexico. And so a lot of people who are initiated into Ocha will work with her, but she is a totally different thing from that. It's just more honestly, it's more like the botanicas that sell all this stuff, kind of try and sell that together. Um, but that's just my opinion. But but she's her own thing. It's hers is very culturally Mexican, whereas like Santeria is Cuban. So she has her own practices and stuff that are very much like part of Mexican folk religion and practices and stuff like that. There's as the spiritual movement. It's because it's not a religion. There's no priest. There's nothing like that. Like it's kind of just devotion to her. But she does have like kind of traditions and things like that of how people are supposed to work with her and things of that sort. Um, and so um, like as a religious movement, things have kind of come in. Like people have borrowed things and put them into like working with her. So, and this is true of kind of outside of Mexico as well as inside of Mexico. So, how people approach her tends to be from the religious standpoint that they're in. So, most people who work with her are do so from a Catholic standpoint. The primary kind of like religious service for her is a rosary. Like you just say the rosary, you say like novenas and light candles. It's very, very Catholic. But then you have people who practice things like brujeria, like witchcraft. You have people that are more into like occultism, and they kind of bring those things into this as well. And so you'll see people working with her in all sorts of different ways. Um, and I'm of the opinion that that's okay as long as it's done respectfully. I do think sometimes things can get crossed that make it a little bit more complicated. Kind of like you said, like there are some people who are santeros or paleros or practice like a Afro-Cuban tradition, and they will incorporate her into stuff like that. It's a bit more murky when it comes to things like that, just because those are sort of like closed practices, whereas hers is not. So there's no formal structure of working with her, but there are traditional ways of working her with her, if that makes sense.
Yeah, got it. And pardon my ignorance because I've never had heard of her before. I think I'd heard of her as a child. So growing up in Miami, I even though down there it's mostly Santeria, which you thank you for outlining that is a different practice, a different belief system. I had heard, but I still had heard this name growing up as a child in Miami. Um, But yeah, thanks for teaching me something I didn't know
She
before.
she's definitely there's definitely like a presence of her in Miami at this point. And it probably like Miami would have been the places where early on she would kind of have been, just because you have like there's I mean there's not like a huge Mexican community there, but there is a substantial Mexican community there. It's like you said, it's more Cuban, and Haitian and Dominican and Caribbean basically. But and when I was in Southern California, that was why, because where I lived, very much like a very strong Mexican and Mexican American community. When I kind of moved back to Rochester, it was funny because I was here as a little kid and I'd never heard of anything like that before. Um, but when I moved back, it was just funny because I'd go into like even not even the botanica, like what the metaphysical shops, and their statues were there, and it was just funny. One thing I will say is that in my own family, uh, veneration of kind of like the dead and even saints, Catholic saints that have kind of that association with things like imagery, like skulls and stuff like that, was very prominent. And so that was actually kind of, I think, one of the reasons why I kind of felt so comfortably in this is because I already kind of grew up around that kind of thing and that imagery. And so when I kind of like came into this, I was just like, oh, well, yeah, like I've already been doing that. It was actually funny because even like my mom, when I like kind of explained to her what Santa Muerte is, I was pretty much said it was like she's like the angel of death, and my mom was like, oh, okay, just okay, yeah, of course.
That's so funny. Well, again, thank you for sharing that because I think that's a really important context. My understanding is that um, this sector within spirituality, I think it's misunderstood a lot and it gets a little confusing. So I thank you for again for outlining that. I do want to go on to the next question, ask you what has been your favorite moment that you feel comfortable sharing, no names if you want to, favorite moment in a client reading that you've had or in a practice reading.
I think in kind of all of them, because it can be it's sort of like a I don't have like a specific one. I will say that, but what it is when um I am in the school of thought that when I give messages, I try to be as evidential as possible. So that is like providing evidence that you have in fact actually communicated with a spirit, with an identity. And so that is the spirits will provide with something that is sort of like a concrete proof, basically, that you are in fact communicating with the spirit. Um, I do saying that I will say I know some people operate differently, and I know that like the meaning behind messages is sometimes in and of itself evidential, like if it's healing and things like that. But I there's something to be said when you can really like hit home with like a very specific detail. And so when I get those details in, those are like my favorite thing. Um, just because sometimes people will like gasp or things like that. And it's just because it's confirming to me, where it's just sort of like I'm not just speaking out words that people are just relating to, but it's sort of like this is like a concrete thing. I recently had a session with someone, and I'm not going to give a ton of details because I don't know if they won't be okay with me talking about all that. But I mentioned seeing something like insanely specific. Like, I mean, this is like an object that is not an everyday object that most people wouldn't even have in their house. Like, it's just describing stuff. And then, like, after the reading was over, she sends me a picture and she's like, "Was it this?" And it was like exactly what I was talking about. And she was just like laughing. She was like, "That's never happened before." And so it's both confirming to me, and I just feel it's kind of good practice to try to be able to provide like details like that, because it helps when people get a message. There's messages like are healing and stuff like that, and but it really kind of makes people take it more seriously when you kind of can provide to that level of clarity. And I think it's more, it's not like me saying like, oh, you have to do that, but it's more people listen more when like you're trying to like give them advice or share something with them that can be healing, and you can kind of confirm it that they take it a little bit more seriously. And so to me that's just probably my favorite thing about giving messages at all, or having any of them. I've had a lot of that happen, and it's just very fun.
So you're saying that telling someone their grandma's here and they love you is not enough? No, I'm kidding. Because that is something that I've seen a lot on, oh, quite a bit on social media, like live readings. Like, your grandmother's here. Is your grandmother passed? Yes. She said she loves you very much. That's all she has to say to you. It's like, well, most grandmothers love their grandchildren. So I agree with you. I think it's important to have a balance of, yes, the
Yeah.
message that we want to drive home, but also like validating that with evidential
On so
material.
I love that you brought that up, because one of the things, so when I'm involved in my spiritual society, we do these Sunday services, which are message services. So we go and do platform mediumship, and all of this is free. And so people will come to hear a message. And I, on one hand, I try to be as evidential as possible, because a lot of people are coming to this very hurt and wanting so desperately to hear something. So, on one hand, giving that message that their grandmother loves them may be exactly what they want to hear, but but like you said, anyone could just say that. So it's, to me, really important to include that evidential piece in there, to where it's like, this isn't someone taking advantage of you. This is actually coming from your grandmother. Like, that's why that's so important in there, because you do have those people that's just like, you know, your grandma's here. She says she loves you. Or let me tell you something that I hear is that not even grandmother. Like, that's not even like, because some people won't even get that. There's a female presence here that is saying that she wishes you love. That is even worse, where it's just even more vague. Because I've heard a lot of that, where it's just because then people will just put in anything they want. Um, I I have a friend that I talk about stuff like this with, and I've called it like spiritualist Mad Libs, where it's you have
That's
these
perfect. It's a
where you have
perfect
like
way.
these mediums that just fill in the blank. It's like, I have a grandmother, aunt, presence here, and she's saying to like, she loves you. Go have fun. Go outside. And it's the same thing every single time with no evidence whatsoever. You also get the people that are like, it's either vague, where it's like a kind of gendered thing, or they'll just be like, you know, I have like, they'll pick someone that's so old that like there is no evidence. It's like, I have like your great great five times grandma here with me, or like I have an aunt or an ancestor with me.
That honestly, I feel a little bad about it, but it bugs the heck out of me. It's like, I think there's nothing wrong with bringing in ancestors, but like
Absolutely.
for example, if I'm gonna bring in an ancestor for somebody, I want to validate that this is an ancestor of theirs by
Yes.
having the ancestor bring up something in that person's current life that I wouldn't know about. So it's
That's evidence. That's an
exactly.
evidential message.
Yeah, and
So yeah,
I think there is yeah, it bugs me, and I do uh it's interesting how there are many folks out there who will charge a lot of money to give readings like that, and if people are happy, that's great. But I think it's like, if you can tell me something, if you're gonna tell me something that anyone could receive, and I wonder if it comes from a fear of being wrong as a psychic medium. I don't know if that's
I
where it comes from.
I do think, I do genuinely think some people are scared of being wrong, but I think part of being like a medium of any kind is that you have to take that kind of that next step. It's part of developing, and if you don't take it, you're never going to be able to really like develop or give a clear message. On the other hand too, I don't I like, on the other hand, like, I do think there is that level of kind of like doubt, but if you don't do that, you're kind of just taking advantage of people, because like there are people, like I said, a lot of people come to this desperate to hear something, and will just take whatever anyone has to say, and they'll make it work. And so that's why kind of like having like a piece of evidence is so important in those situations. And like you said, like I also will like I'll bring through like spirit guides and ancestors and stuff, but I will like try and actually provide like some kind of piece of like this is something about you that they know that you can confirm as like an evidential thing. Like, and in some cases too, that may actually, because for some people who come for readings, they already know what their spirit guides are, what they look like. So you actually could be describing like a spirit guide to someone, and that is evidence. It's just it's evidence to that person. So it's just a matter of just trying to not take advantage of people on one hand, and then also like push yourself. Like if you won't be able to develop and kind of hone in on your skills if you don't mess up. Some readings aren't good. Like some not all of them can be great. Like some just happen. Like I think you mentioned this at one point earlier where I think it was when you were talking about the butterflies where like just say it. If it doesn't make sense, you just tell people, you know what? Maybe it'll make sense later. Like just or maybe it's for someone else. Maybe it's for you to give to someone else. So you just kind of have to try.
Yeah, it takes trust. It takes trust in our ability, trust in spirit more than anything. And yeah, there's a lot of, I know I've done a lot of, and still have yet to do more inner work to develop that trust more. So, a last question before we hop off. What is one myth about your work that if you could debunk it right now, you would?
This is actually fun because I have like a really good segue kind of into this about what you just said. Um, I think it's that for a lot of people, people associate specifically with spiritual. I'm kind of specifically talking about spiritualism here, but this could be true of other kind of like spiritual development work. A lot of people think that giving readings is the be all end all of developing their spirituality. And I that is horribly wrong on so many different levels. Um, if you just for people who like just focus so much on doing readings, it's usually just reading after reading after reading, and then you just burn out. Like you either burn out or you get sick of it because there's so much like what you said about inner work. Like spiritualism as a tradition is like a tiny bit of mediumship, and then the rest is all of this just amazing inner work that you do. And it's not even just inner work. It's work on yourself. You have like it's meditation, prayer, having a relationship with spirit. But then it's also outer work. It's being part of a community. It's helping other people. It's doing kind things to help people. All of that is part of like being a spiritualist. Spiritualism is a way of life, and I feel like it tends to get reduced to just only giving messages and readings. Um, Kind of like the little adage that spiritism kind of promotes is that it's like faith, hope, and charity. You have like faith in God, your faith in yourself, faith in the spirits, and hope in just positivity, and charity and helping people. You combine all of these things, and that is spiritual development. Is taking care of like kind of holistically yourself in this way, both yourself as connected to spirit and yourself as connected to other people. And that is what development is. It's not just sitting, kind of talking to the dead in a dark room. It's being engaged with other people, with yourself. And that's kind of one of the things I really, really want to hit home is that I feel like spiritualism gets this kind of rap of being just like this kind of thing you do by yourself, and only to give messages. And in actuality, it's entirely about connecting with other people, connecting with God, and just really just having like a way of life that is kind of in harmony with just the natural world.
I couldn't agree more with you. A phrase that keeps popping up. I think God, the universe, is trying to tell me something. But the phrase spiritual bypassing has come up a lot in other people's podcasts recently, in conversations in like live conversations with people in person a lot, virtually, and I think it's so easy to, at least when I first discovered my ability or rediscovered, however we want to put it, 3 years ago. Um, I wasn't sure what to do with it. And I think I had this idea that, oh, I can do readings. This is pretty crazy and incredible. I thought that that was the destination, was like being able to do readings. But then I quickly learned through a mentor, thank God for my mentor, that told me, like, Juan, in order to help you develop more as a medium, let's do some inner child work. I'm like, and I said this in a podcast recently. I'm like, what does inner child work have to do with being a medium? I'm just channeling the dead for people. Like what? And I quickly realized, sorry for the
Yep.
ding. Restart that. I quickly realized that it opened up that my heart center so much and made me a more even more. I'm a pretty empathetic person, I like to think, but an even more empathetic, intuitive worker. And I think this idea that I think that's what creates ignoring the personal development part of spiritualism and spirituality, in my opinion, I think is what sometimes produces people, especially on social media, who seem to really do this work from their ego and not so much from the heart center or from that place of doing this for the healing benefit of others. I don't know. What do you think?
You're being a lot nicer than I am. It's because people
That's
like
no
people
shade.
replace yeah, people replace that inner work with money. That's what that and then
Yes,
that's
yes.
that. And so it's like it's there's like faith, hope, and charity. It's faith, hope, and cash. Where people where people literally like they don't care, and it's just yeah. So and I mean there are people I think obviously who are more just they're trying their best, and those are usually the ones that burn out real quick, and that's where it's good to like kind of what you said, where you have a teacher that helped you. I'm the same way. I had like all these, I had a very supportive community. And so that really helped kind of guide me and stuff like that. But on the other hand, you get people that they know exactly what they're doing. And what they're doing is they're basically just trying to scam people. And there's unfortunately a lot of those people. And I think that's why it's also good kind of just to really promote like healing and helping people and stuff like that. Because when people see that what you're doing is actually legitimate and like from a good place, that in and of itself is enough. Like that will bring in the right people. Um and just being yourself um authentically for like as a medium or a reader, as a spiritualist, coming from like that place of kind of kindness, um that will open up so many doors for you because people know, and some people may get tricked by these other readers and stuff that are basically scamming people, but when people see the real thing, they appreciate it, and that will just make your life go exactly in the direction that it's supposed to.
I totally agree. Well, how can people find out more about you online and find you on social?
So pretty much everything for me is literally just Stephen Patrick Spiritualist. So like my website is stephenpatrickspiritualist.com, and then all of my like social links are linked there. My blogs are all linked there, like where I keep like my research for like history stuff. Um, I will say that probably like if people want like to contact me, the quickest way is probably Instagram, which is Stephen Patrick Spiritualist. I will also plug my spiritual society that I'm part of is the Rochester Spiritual Society. That's rochesterspiritualsociety.org. And then we also have that also links you to like Facebook, YouTube. Actually, all of our talks that we do, like on Sundays, our lectures are all on there. So if you want to learn stuff, you go there. And then also there's an Instagram again that's all just on the website. But for myself, it's just Stephen Patrick Spiritualist on basically every platform.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, I loved our conversation. I could talk to you forever. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
No problem. Glad to be here. We need to do this again.
Yeah, yes, absolutely we should. So you'll hear from me. If you have a question or topic you want me to cover on Third Eyesight, head to my website, juanfranciscospirit.com/contact, and send a message my way. If you really enjoyed this episode, leave a review wherever you listen. I'd really appreciate it.